A lonely road, a chilling night, and a stranger who shouldn't be there. Some roads lead home, but others lead to something much darker. What happens when you stop for the wrong person? Tonight, we bring you a tale of terror, mystery, and the unknown. Are you ready to face the stranger on the lonely road? The stranger on the lonely road. It was a quiet evening, and the sky above was painted in fading shades of orange and purple. My uncle, a man of simple habits and few fears, was walking down a lonely dirt road. The wind whispered through the tall grass on either side, and the crunch of his boots on the gravel was the only sound breaking the stillness. He was a mile away from the nearest town when he spotted something, or someone, up ahead. A man was walking in the same direction, his shoulders hunched and his gait uneven. At first, my uncle thought nothing of it. Travelers often passed one another on these roads. But as he drew closer, he noticed something strange about the man. The stranger walked stiffly, his arms swinging in an oddly mechanical way. His face was partially obscured by the brim of a battered hat, but his eyes, dark and wide, flicked nervously toward my uncle. There was fear in them, unmistakable fear. And then my uncle realized something else. He was just as scared of the man as the man seemed to be of him. They passed each other without a word, their steps falling into rhythm. Though the stranger kept his distance, my uncle could feel his presence, like a shadow that refused to fall behind. The stranger kept glancing at him, his eyes darting nervously in the twilight. My uncle tried to ignore him, but his own unease was growing. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the road became darker. Shadows stretched and merged into an inky blackness that seemed to swallow the landscape. The trees lining the road whispered in the wind, their branches swaying like skeletal hands. The stranger slowed his pace until he was walking side by side with my uncle. Their eyes met briefly, and my uncle's stomach turned. The man's face looked pale, almost gray, and his expression was tight with terror. He was sweating, despite the cool evening air. What's wrong with him? My uncle thought, his hands clenching at his sides. Then another thought crept in, unbidden. What if he's scared because of me? What if he knows something I don't? The road narrowed as they entered the woods. The towering trees blocked what little moonlight there was, plunging the path into near total darkness. My uncle could barely see the stranger now, but he could hear his uneven breathing and the crunch of his boots. Each sound made his own fear mount. The man glanced at him again, and my uncle caught a clearer look at his face. The stranger's eyes were bloodshot, and his lips were trembling as though he were holding back a scream. My uncle felt the hair on the back of his neck rise. He wanted to speak, to break the silence, but something in his throat tightened, choking off his words. Deeper into the woods they went. The air grew colder, and the sounds of the night seemed to fade, leaving only the echo of their footsteps. My uncle became acutely aware of the weight of his own body, the pulse of his heartbeat pounding in his ears. The man looked at him again, his fear now unmistakable. My uncle's own fear mirrored it. He thought, why is he so scared of me? Is it because he knows something terrible? Or is it because I should be scared of him? The woods seemed to stretch endlessly. The further they walked, the darker it became. The trees loomed closer together, their gnarled branches twisting into unnatural shapes. The air felt heavy, suffocating, as if the forest itself were alive and watching. Suddenly, the man broke the silence. His voice was hoarse and trembling. Why are you following me? My uncle stopped in his tracks, stunned. I'm not following you, he said, his voice shaking. You're the one walking with me. The stranger's eyes widened, his face twisting in confusion and terror. I wasn't walking with you, he shouted. He stopped, his mouth hanging open as his gaze darted past my uncle into the shadows behind him. What is it? My uncle asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man took a shaky step backward, pointing with a trembling finger. Something's behind you. My uncle spun around, but there was nothing there, just the darkness of the woods. He turned back to the man, his heart hammering in his chest. You're imagining things, he said, though his voice betrayed his own fear. The man shook his head violently. No, it's there. I saw it, something moving. It's following us. The air around them seemed to grow colder. My uncle glanced into the shadows, his breath quickening. And then he heard it, a faint rustling, just beyond the trees. It sounded too deliberate to be the wind. "Did you hear that?" the man whispered. "Yes," my uncle replied, his voice barely audible. The rustling grew louder, closer. My uncle's blood ran cold as he realized it wasn't just rustling, it was footsteps. Something was moving toward them, slow and deliberate. "Run," the man whispered. "We have to run." But my uncle couldn't move. His legs felt like lead, rooted to the ground. The footsteps grew louder, and then a low, guttural growl echoed through the trees. "Run!" the man screamed, and he bolted down the path. My uncle finally found his feet and took off after him. They ran blindly through the woods, branches clawing at their faces, the growling sound growing louder behind them. My uncle didn't dare look back. The sound of something crashing through the underbrush was enough to keep him moving. Suddenly, the man tripped and fell, crying out as he hit the ground. My uncle skidded to a stop, turning back to help him. But as he reached out, a shadow fell over them both. The growling stopped. The woods fell silent. The man looked up, his face twisted in terror. "It's here," he whispered. Before my uncle could react, a deafening scream pierced the air, and the darkness seemed to close in around them. The next morning, search parties found the dirt road, but neither my uncle nor the man was ever seen again. The only clue was a single set of footprints leading deep into the woods, and the faint whisper of the wind saying, "Why are you scared?"